My name is Joseph. I'm 42 years old, and on March 1st, 2014, Islamic militants in Syria placed me on my knees and raised a sword to behead me for preaching about Jesus Christ. What happened next shook an entire nation and changed my life forever. I was 19 when God first whispered to my heart about ministry. Growing up in Damascus as the youngest of three children, I had watched my father work as a carpenter and my mother tend to our small household with quiet devotion. Every Sunday, our family would walk 15 minutes to the ancient stone church where generations of my ancestors had worshipped. The smell of incense and the sound of hymns in Arabic filled my childhood memories with warmth and security, but it was during one particular evening prayer service that I felt something shift inside my chest. The pastor was reading from Isaiah 6, where the prophet hears God asking whom he should send, when he read the words, "Here am I, send me." Something ignited in my spirit that I had never experienced before. My hands began to shake, and tears I could not explain streamed down my face. I knew in that moment that God was calling me to serve him, though I had no idea what that would cost me. My parents were not entirely surprised when I announced my intention to enter seminary. My mother had often told relatives that I was different from my brothers, more serious about faith, always asking questions about God during our family devotions. My father, however, expressed concern. Syria in the early 2000s was becoming an increasingly difficult place for Christians to live openly. He had witnessed friends lose jobs for being too vocal about their faith, and he feared for my safety. Seminary training in Damascus was both exhilarating and sobering. I studied under professors who had themselves faced persecution, learning not just theology, but also the practical realities of ministry in a hostile environment. They taught us how to read the political climate, how to protect our congregations, and most importantly, how to remain faithful when faith became dangerous. I threw myself into my studies with complete dedication, often staying up until dawn, memorizing scripture and practicing sermons. It was during my final year of seminary that I met Sarah at a Christian fellowship gathering. She was 22, working as a teacher in a local Christian school, with eyes that reflected both gentleness and surprising strength. When I told her about my calling to pastor a church, she did not flinch at the potential dangers. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes and said she felt called to stand beside me in ministry. We were married 6 months after my graduation in 2009. The decision to establish our ministry in Aleppo came after months of prayer and fasting. Several established churches in Damascus had offered me assistant pastor positions, safe roles that would have provided security and steady income. But during our prayer times, both Sarah and I felt God directing us toward Aleppo, where there was a significant population of Christians but few strong evangelical churches. The city had a reputation for being more tolerant than other parts of Syria, and we believed we could build something meaningful there. Our first church service was held in the living room of our small apartment with 8 people present. I remember standing before that tiny congregation, my Bible trembling in my hands, and feeling both terrified and completely alive. Over the following months, our fellowship grew steadily. People hungered for authentic worship and practical Bible teaching. Within 2 years, we had 50 regular attendees meeting in a rented storefront that we had converted into a simple sanctuary. Those were precious days. I baptized new believers in a small river outside the city. Sarah organized women's Bible studies that drew seekers from the Muslim community. We performed Christian weddings and provided counseling to couples facing marriage difficulties. The church became a beacon of hope in a community that was beginning to experience the early tremors of political instability. But by 2011, everything began to change. The Syrian civil war, which had started with peaceful protests, escalated into armed conflict that touched every corner of the country. Aleppo, once known for its bustling markets and ancient architecture, became divided between government and rebel-controlled territories. The sound of gunfire and explosions became part of our daily soundtrack. The war brought with it a new kind of religious extremism that specifically targeted Christians. Islamic militant groups began operating in areas around Aleppo, and they viewed Christian churches as symbols of Western influence that needed to be eliminated. I started receiving anonymous notes slipped under our church door at night. The first one simply said, "Stop preaching the cross or face consequences." The second was more explicit, threatening harm to my family if I continued holding services. Local authorities, overwhelmed by the broader conflict, offered little protection. A police captain I had known for several years pulled me aside after one particularly threatening incident and advised me to consider relocating my family. He could not guarantee our safety, he said, and suggested we might want to join the thousands of Christians who were fleeing Syria for Lebanon or Jordan. The threats escalated throughout 2012 and 2013. Our church attendance began to drop as families made the difficult decision to leave the country. Those who remained were genuinely afraid to be seen entering our building. I started varying our service times and locations, sometimes meeting in homes, other times in the basement of a sympathetic business owner. Sarah and I had numerous late-night conversations about whether we should pack our belongings and seek refuge elsewhere. Ask yourself this question. When God calls you to serve, do you run when circumstances become difficult? This was the question that kept me awake at night. I knew that fleeing would mean abandoning the congregation members who had no means to leave, the new believers who still needed discipleship, and the seeking souls who were just beginning to explore faith in Christ. How could I claim to be their shepherd if I abandoned them when wolves appeared? In January 2014, Sarah and I made our final decision. After a week of fasting and prayer, we committed to staying in Aleppo regardless of the consequences. We called our parents and explained our choice, asking for their prayers and understanding. My mother wept on the phone, but both sets of parents ultimately supported our decision. We had placed our lives completely in God's hands. The final weeks of February 2014 felt like the calm before a storm. Our remaining congregation members were incredibly dedicated, knowing that simply showing up for church could put them in danger. We prayed with unusual intensity during those services, sensing that we were living through something that would test our faith beyond anything we had previously experienced. I preached with a boldness that surprised even me, feeling that each sermon could potentially be my last. On the evening of February 28th, Sarah and I prayed together before bed as we had every night of our marriage. Neither of us spoke about the fear we both felt, but as we held each other that night, I sensed that our life as we knew it was about to change forever. I had no idea that in less than 12 hours, armed men would burst through our church doors and my real test of faith would begin. March 1st, 2014 began like any other Sunday morning. Sarah woke me at 6 o'clock as usual, and we shared coffee and prayer time at our small kitchen table before preparing for the morning service. I had been studying John 15:13 all week, the verse that says, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." The irony of that text was not lost on me as I reviewed my sermon notes one final time. By 8:30, we had arrived at our small church building and begun setting up chairs in the main sanctuary. The space could hold 70 people when full, but these days we were grateful if 20 showed up. Fear had driven many of our members away, not from lack of faith, but from very real concern for their family's safety. Those who continued to attend were the most committed believers I had ever known, people who understood that following Christ sometimes meant risking everything. That morning, only 20 souls gathered for worship. I recognized each face, the elderly woman who had been attending since we started. Despite her son's pleas for her to stay home, the young father who brought his 2 small children even though his wife had stopped coming months earlier, the teenage boy whose parents had fled to Lebanon but who had chosen to remain in Aleppo to finish his schooling. These people had become more than congregation members to me. They were family, bound together by shared danger and unwavering faith. I began preaching from John 15 at exactly 9 o'clock. The morning sunlight streamed through our simple windows as I spoke about Jesus' ultimate sacrifice and how love requires us to lay down our own desires for the benefit of others. About 20 minutes into my sermon, I noticed several congregation members glancing nervously toward the front entrance. At first, I assumed they were reacting to the sound of distant gunfire, which had become commonplace in our war-torn city. Then I heard the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come, the roar of multiple vehicles pulling up directly outside our building. The engines were loud, aggressive, not the quiet hum of civilian cars, but the throaty growl of military-style trucks. Every person in the sanctuary froze, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the humid Syrian air. Within seconds, the front doors exploded open with such force that they slammed against the walls. 6 armed men dressed in black clothing and carrying assault rifles poured into our sanctuary. Their faces were covered with black masks, leaving only their eyes visible, eyes that burned with hatred and purpose. The lead man immediately began shouting commands in Arabic, demanding that everyone get down on the floor. In that moment of terror, my pastoral instincts took over. While the congregation members dropped to their knees and pressed their faces against the cold tile floor, I remained standing behind the pulpit. I shouted over the chaos, telling our people to remain calm and to exit through the back door if they could safely reach it. Several of the younger members, including the teenage boy, managed to slip out during the initial confusion. The lead militant strode directly toward me, his weapon pointed at my chest. He spoke in accented Arabic, clearly identifying me as the pastor, and declaring that I was under arrest for crimes against Islam. It became immediately clear that this was not a random raid, but a targeted operation. Someone in our community had provided them with specific information about our church schedule and my identity. As the other militants secured the building and prevented anyone else from escaping, I caught sight of Sarah near the back of the sanctuary. Her face was pale with terror, but her eyes met mine with a look that communicated everything words could not express. In that single glance, we said goodbye to the life we had built together, though neither of us knew whether it would be temporary or permanent. The lead militant produced a set of zip ties and roughly pulled my hands behind my back, securing them so tightly that I could immediately feel my circulation being cut off. He leaned close to my ear and whispered in broken English, "You think your Jesus will save you now?" The breath behind his mask smelled of cigarettes and hatred. I managed to respond quietly that Jesus had already saved me, which seemed to enrage him further. As they dragged me toward the front entrance, I used my last moments of freedom to address my congregation. I shouted over the militants' angry voices, telling our people that I loved them and that they should continue to meet together and encourage one another. I urged them to take care of Sarah and to remember that God's love was stronger than any weapon or threat. The last thing I saw before being forced outside was the elderly woman weeping and reaching toward me. Her weathered hands stretched out as if trying to pull me back to safety. The militants shoved me into the back of a covered military truck that smelled of diesel fuel and fear. 2 armed guards sat on either side of me while the lead militant climbed into the passenger seat of the cab. As the truck lurched forward, I could hear Sarah's voice calling my name from somewhere behind us, a sound that cut through my heart more sharply than any physical pain could have done. The journey to my place of captivity took approximately 2 hours, though it felt like an eternity. The truck traveled on increasingly rough roads, suggesting we were moving away from the city center toward the rural outskirts of Aleppo. My guards remained silent throughout the trip, occasionally checking their weapons or speaking quietly into radio devices, but they made no attempt to communicate with me directly. During that ride, I prayed silently and continuously. I prayed for Sarah's safety and for the protection of our remaining congregation members. I prayed for strength to endure whatever awaited me. Most importantly, I prayed for my captors, asking God to soften their hearts and help them see the truth of Christ's love, even as they transported me toward what I suspected would be my death. When the truck finally stopped, I was immediately blindfolded and led across uneven ground that felt like gravel mixed with sand. I could smell motor oil and hear the distant sound of machinery, suggesting we had arrived at some kind of industrial facility or warehouse. The air was cooler here, and I sensed we were in a more isolated location where my captors could operate without fear of being observed or interrupted. They removed my blindfold in a concrete room approximately 10 feet square, with a single small window near the ceiling and a heavy metal door. The space contained nothing except a thin mat on the floor and a plastic bucket in the corner. This would be my home for the next 7 days, though at the time I had no way of knowing how long my imprisonment would last. The lead militant, who I later learned was called the commander, stood before me and delivered what amounted to my death sentence. He explained in careful English that I had been convicted by their religious court of converting Muslims to Christianity and corrupting the youth of Syria with Western religious ideas. My punishment was death by beheading, but first I would be given the opportunity to convert to Islam and publicly renounce my Christian faith. He informed me that I would have 1 week to consider my options. Each day I would be brought before their religious council and given the chance to convert. If I refused, the interrogations would become increasingly persuasive until I either accepted Islam or faced execution. The commander seemed confident that few people could withstand their methods of persuasion for very long. As the metal door slammed shut and I heard multiple locks being engaged, I sank to my knees on that concrete floor and wept. Not from fear, though I certainly felt afraid, but from the overwhelming realization that my real test of faith had finally begun. Everything I had preached about trusting God in difficult circumstances was about to be put to the ultimate examination. The daily interrogations began on my second day of captivity and followed the same brutal pattern for 6 consecutive days. Each morning at dawn, 3 guards would unlock my cell and escort me to a larger room where the commander and 2 other men sat behind a metal table. The room was deliberately kept cold, and bright lights were positioned to shine directly into my eyes, making it difficult to see my interrogators clearly. The commander would begin each session by placing a Quran on the table and asking me to read specific passages aloud in Arabic. When I explained that my Arabic was not sufficient for reading classical religious texts, he would have one of his assistants read the passages while demanding that I agree with their interpretation. The verses always focused on the supremacy of Islam over Christianity and the requirement for all people to submit to Allah. After the Quranic readings, they would present me with a prepared statement renouncing Jesus Christ as the Son of God and declaring Muhammad as the final prophet. The paper was typed in both Arabic and English, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Each day, I would refuse to sign the document, explaining that I could not deny the truth about Jesus even if it cost me my life. The physical beatings began on the 3rd day when I refused to sign their conversion document. 2 guards would hold my arms while a third struck me with a wooden baton across my back and ribs. They were careful not to inflict injuries that would prevent me from speaking clearly on camera, but the pain was excruciating. Between the blows, the commander would ask if I was ready to reconsider their offer. The psychological torture was perhaps even more difficult to endure than the physical abuse. They forced me to watch videos on a laptop computer showing other pastors and Christian leaders who had been captured by similar groups. Some had converted to Islam on camera and were released. Others had refused and were beheaded while the camera recorded their final moments. The commander would pause the videos at crucial moments and ask if I understood what my future held. On the 4th day, they brought news about my family that nearly broke my spirit entirely. The commander claimed that his associates had visited Sarah and informed her that she could secure my release by publicly converting to Islam herself and encouraging other Christian women to do the same. According to his account, she had refused their offer and told them she would rather be widowed than married to a man who denied Christ. Whether this story was true or fabricated to torment me, I could not know, but it sounded exactly like something Sarah would say. Sleep became nearly impossible during those 7 days. The guards would bang on my cell door at random intervals throughout the night, preventing me from achieving more than an hour or 2 of continuous rest. When I did manage to fall asleep, I was tormented by nightmares about Sarah being harmed or my congregation members being hunted down because of my ministry. The lack of sleep made everything else more difficult to endure and clouded my ability to think clearly. The food consisted of stale bread and dirty water provided once each day. By the 5th day, I had lost significant weight and felt constantly dizzy from hunger and dehydration. My captors explained that my physical discomfort was entirely within my control and could end immediately if I simply agreed to their demands. All I had to do was sign one piece of paper and speak a few words on camera, and my suffering would be over. Despite the physical and emotional torment, I found unexpected strength during my evening prayer times. After each brutal interrogation session, I would return to my cell and spend hours reciting every Bible verse I could remember. Psalm 23 became my constant companion. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Those words took on a meaning I had never understood during my comfortable years as a seminary student. On the 6th day, the commander informed me that their patience was exhausted. He had received orders from his superiors to conclude my case one way or another. If I had not converted by sunset the following day, I would be executed at dawn on March 8th. The execution would be filmed and distributed internationally as a warning to other Christian leaders who refused to submit to Islamic authority. That night, March 7th, 2014, I experienced the darkest hours of my entire life. The finality of my situation became impossible to ignore. In less than 12 hours, I would either deny everything I believed about Jesus Christ or face a violent death that would leave Sarah a widow and our congregation without their pastor. The weight of that choice pressed down on me like a physical burden that made breathing difficult. I spent the entire night on my knees, alternating between desperate prayers for divine intervention and quiet acceptance of what seemed to be God's will for my life. I thought about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking the Father to take away the cup of suffering, but ultimately submitting to the divine plan. I tried to follow that example, praying for courage to remain faithful regardless of the consequences. During those final hours, I wrote a mental letter to Sarah that I hoped someone might eventually convey to her. I wanted her to know that my love for her had never wavered, that I was grateful for every day we had shared together, and that I hoped she would find strength to continue serving Christ even after my death. I also composed messages for each of our close friends and congregation members, trying to encourage them to remain strong in faith despite losing their pastor. As dawn approached on March 8th, I made peace with God about my approaching death. I forgave my captors in my heart, understanding that they believed they were serving God according to their understanding. I asked for forgiveness for any failures in my own ministry and committed my spirit into God's hands, just as Jesus had done on the cross. In that concrete cell surrounded by darkness and despair, I experienced a peace that truly surpassed all understanding. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question. If you faced the same choice I was facing, would you have the courage to choose death over denial? I pray that you never have to answer that question in reality. But I also pray that if such a moment comes, you will find the same supernatural peace that sustained me during those terrifying hours. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I heard the familiar sound of multiple locks being disengaged on my cell door. 3 guards entered and informed me that it was time for my final journey. They allowed me to wash my face and hands with cold water from a small basin, a gesture of respect that surprised me. Then they bound my hands behind my back with rope and led me out of the building for the last time. The execution site was a concrete courtyard behind the warehouse where I had been held. A video camera was already set up on a tripod, and I could see several militants gathering to witness my death. The morning air was cool and fresh after 7 days in my stuffy cell, and I found myself grateful for the sensation of wind against my skin, knowing it would be among my final earthly experiences. The commander positioned me directly in front of the video camera, while one of his assistants adjusted the equipment to ensure optimal recording quality. 12 militants formed a semicircle around the execution site, their faces covered with black masks and their weapons held at ready position. The atmosphere was ceremonial, almost ritualistic, as if they had performed this exact procedure many times before. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard, and I could hear the distant sounds of the city waking up. Cars honking, roosters crowing, children playing somewhere beyond the warehouse walls. Life was continuing normally, just a few hundred yards away, while I prepared to leave this world. The contrast between the ordinary sounds of daily existence and the extraordinary circumstances of my approaching death created a surreal quality that made everything feel like a vivid dream. The commander stepped in front of the camera and began speaking in Arabic for what I assumed was an introductory statement about my crimes and the justice of my punishment. His voice carried the confident tone of a man who believed completely in the righteousness of his actions. When he finished his prepared remarks, he gestured for me to move closer to the camera for my final opportunity to convert. Looking directly into the camera lens, I saw my own reflection in the glass and was startled by how much I had changed during 7 days of captivity. My face was gaunt from lack of food, my eyes were sunken from sleep deprivation, and my beard had grown wild and unkempt. But behind the physical deterioration, I could see something in my eyes that had not been there a week earlier, an unshakable peace that could only come from God. I began to speak, knowing that my words would potentially be seen by thousands of people around the world, including Sarah and my congregation members. Instead of recanting my faith as my captors expected, I used those precious moments to deliver what I knew would be my final sermon. I spoke about the love of Jesus Christ, about his sacrifice on the cross for the redemption of all humanity, and about the hope of eternal life that belongs to everyone who believes in him. The commander initially seemed confused by my response, perhaps expecting me to beg for mercy or at least show some hesitation about my impending death. When he realized that I was preaching rather than converting, his face darkened with rage. He shouted for me to stop speaking and demanded that I recite the Islamic declaration of faith. But I continued proclaiming the gospel with a boldness that surprised even me. I told the camera that I forgave my captors for what they were about to do, explaining that Jesus had taught us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. I expressed my gratitude for the privilege of suffering for Christ's sake and declared that my death would not be a defeat but a victory, because it would unite me with my Savior in paradise. Several of the militants shifted uncomfortably as I spoke, perhaps not expecting such confidence from a man facing execution. When I finished speaking, the commander angrily ordered the camera to be turned off. He was clearly frustrated that I had used his propaganda platform to strengthen the very faith he was trying to destroy. Two guards forced me to my knees on the concrete while the commander paced back and forth, apparently deciding whether to proceed with the execution or attempt another round of persuasion. The man chosen to perform the execution was someone I had not seen during my interrogations. He was tall and powerfully built, with muscular arms that suggested years of physical labor. The other militants referred to him respectfully as the swordsman, and it was clear that he was considered an expert in his deadly craft. He wore black clothing like the others, but his mask covered only the lower half of his face, leaving his dark eyes visible and cold. The swordsman approached, carrying a curved sword with a gleaming blade approximately 3 feet long. The weapon appeared to be of exceptional quality, with intricate engravings along the steel and a leather-wrapped handle worn smooth from frequent use. He tested the edge with his thumb, apparently ensuring that the blade was sharp enough to complete his task with a single stroke. As I knelt on the concrete with my hands bound behind my back, the swordsman positioned himself slightly behind and to my right, exactly as I had seen in the horrifying videos they had forced me to watch. The other militants formed a tighter circle around us, their cameras and phones ready to record the moment of my death. The commander gave a final speech in Arabic that I assumed was meant to justify my execution according to their interpretation of Islamic law. The swordsman raised his sword high above his head, the blade catching the morning sunlight and creating a brief flash of brilliance that momentarily blinded me. In that instant, I closed my eyes and whispered my final prayer, "Jesus, receive my spirit." I thought about Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who had spoken similar words as he was being stoned to death. I felt honored to join the countless believers throughout history who had died rather than deny their Lord. I could sense the swordsman's muscles tensing as he prepared to bring the blade down with lethal force. The militants around us fell completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to fade away, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then something happened that defies every natural law I understand and challenges every assumption about how the physical world operates. As the swordsman began his downward swing, time itself seemed to slow and then stop entirely. The blade, which had been moving with incredible speed and force, suddenly halted in midair, as if it had struck an invisible barrier. A brilliant white light filled the entire courtyard, far brighter than the sun, but somehow not painful to look at directly. The light seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, bathing every surface and person in its radiance. The temperature dropped dramatically within seconds, as if we had been transported from the warm Syrian morning into the depths of winter. Every electronic device in the area, including the video cameras, cell phones, and two-way radios, suddenly shut down simultaneously, despite having full battery power moments before. The silence that followed was absolute and profound, broken only by the sound of several militants gasping in terror and confusion. The swordsman himself cried out in a voice filled with fear and awe, his weapon clattering to the concrete as his hands began shaking uncontrollably. He stumbled backward, pointing at something above my head that only he could see clearly. In Arabic mixed with broken English, he kept repeating, I see him, the Christ is here." 8 of the 12 militants immediately fell prostrate on the ground, some weeping, others calling out for mercy in languages I could not understand. The overwhelming sense of divine presence filled the space around us with such intensity that even breathing became difficult. This was not merely a supernatural event, but an encounter with the living God that left no room for doubt or explanation. The ropes binding my hands loosened and fell away without any human intervention, dropping to the ground as if they had been cut by an invisible knife. I stood up freely while the militants remained on the ground, too overwhelmed by what they were witnessing to think about preventing my escape. The commander, who had always projected such confidence and authority, was backing away toward the warehouse wall, his face pale with terror beneath his mask. He shouted orders for his men to restrain me, but none of them were capable of responding. They remained on their knees or flat on their faces, completely incapacitated by the divine encounter they were experiencing. Look inside your own heart right now and tell me, do you believe that the God who created the universe is capable of intervening in human affairs when it serves his purposes? What you believe about that question will determine how you receive the rest of my testimony, because what happened next was even more extraordinary than what I have already described. The divine presence lingered in that courtyard for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably no more than 10 minutes in actual time. As the brilliant light gradually faded, the militants slowly began to lift their heads and look around in bewilderment. The swordsman remained on his knees, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the spot where I was standing. His sword lay forgotten on the concrete beside him, its blade now seeming ordinary and powerless. The commander was the first to regain his composure, though his voice shook as he ordered his men to let me go immediately. He refused to look directly at me, keeping his eyes focused on the ground as he spoke. There was no discussion, no debate, no attempt to understand what had just occurred. He simply commanded two of his militants to escort me back to the city, and within minutes, I was sitting in the passenger seat of a pickup truck, traveling the same route that had brought me to captivity 7 days earlier. My escorts for the return journey were two of the men who had fallen prostrate during the supernatural encounter. They spoke very little during the drive, occasionally glancing at me with expressions that mixed fear, awe, and something that resembled reverence. One of them, a young man who could not have been older than 25, finally broke the silence by asking in broken English if I would pray for him. I spent the remainder of the journey praying aloud for both men, asking God to reveal his truth to them and to heal their hearts from the hatred they had been carrying. When we reached the outskirts of Aleppo, they stopped the truck and one of them handed me a slip of paper with an address written in Arabic. He explained that the swordsman wanted to meet with me at that location in 3 days, if I was willing to see him. The request astonished me, but I agreed to consider it. They drove away without looking back, leaving me standing on a street corner just a few blocks from our church building. I walked those final blocks in a daze, still struggling to process everything that had happened. The familiar sights and sounds of my neighborhood seemed surreal after a week of captivity. Street vendors were selling fruit from their carts, children were playing soccer in an empty lot, and elderly men were sitting outside coffee shops playing backgammon. Life had continued normally while my entire world had been transformed. When I reached our church, I found Sarah and 15 congregation members gathered in the main sanctuary, holding a prayer vigil for my safe return. The door was unlocked, and I simply walked inside without announcement. The moment Sarah saw me, she cried out and ran across the room, throwing her arms around me with such force that we both nearly fell to the ground. The other church members surrounded us, weeping and praising God for what they understood was a miraculous deliverance. Sarah held my face in her hands and examined every bruise and cut, asking repeatedly if I was truly all right. I told her that I was more than all right, that I had witnessed the power of God in a way that few human beings ever experience. But I also knew that my appearance told a different story. I had lost at least 20 pounds, my clothes were filthy and torn, and the physical evidence of my beatings was visible on my face and hands. Word of my return spread through our Christian community with remarkable speed. By evening, our small church building was packed with people who had come to hear firsthand what had happened during my captivity. I stood before that crowd and shared my testimony for the first time, describing every detail of the supernatural intervention that had saved my life. Some listeners wept, others shouted praises to God, and a few seemed skeptical of the more extraordinary elements of my account. Within hours, news of the incident had spread beyond our immediate community through social media and word of mouth. Someone had filmed a video testimony on their phone and uploaded it to Facebook, where it began circulating rapidly among Syrian Christians. By the next morning, I was receiving phone calls from pastors in Damascus, Homs, and even Lebanon who wanted to hear the story directly from me. The third day after my release, I kept my appointment to meet the swordsman at the address he had provided. The location turned out to be a small coffee shop in a neutral part of the city, owned by an elderly Christian man who had agreed to host our meeting. When I arrived, the swordsman was already there, sitting alone at a corner table with his head in his hands. He was not wearing his mask, and I was struck by how young he appeared without it. He could not have been older than 30, with dark hair and eyes that reflected deep spiritual turmoil. When he saw me enter the coffee shop, he immediately stood and approached me with obvious nervousness. Without any preamble, he fell to his knees right there in the public space and begged me to forgive him for what he had attempted to do. The conversation that followed lasted more than 3 hours and changed both of our lives forever. He told me his name was Ahmad and explained that he had become involved with the militant group after losing his entire family in a government bombing raid 2 years earlier. His hatred for anyone associated with the West, including Christians, had consumed him completely until the moment he tried to execute me. Ahmad described his experience during the supernatural encounter in vivid detail. He said that as he raised his sword to strike me, he suddenly saw a figure standing directly behind me, someone he immediately recognized as Jesus Christ from descriptions he had heard in childhood. The figure was tall and radiant, wearing white robes that seemed to emanate light, and his eyes held both infinite love and absolute authority. According to Ahmad, Jesus had spoken to him without words, communicating directly to his heart that I was under divine protection and that any attempt to harm me would be futile. More importantly, he felt an overwhelming conviction about the hatred he had been carrying and a supernatural understanding of God's love for all people, including himself. The experience had shattered his worldview completely and left him desperate to understand the truth about Christianity. I spent those 3 hours sharing the gospel with Ahmad, explaining God's plan of salvation and the forgiveness available through Jesus Christ. When I invited him to accept Christ as his personal savior, he responded immediately and passionately. We prayed together right there in that coffee shop, and I watched as years of hatred and anger melted away from his face. Ahmad's conversion became the first of many that followed in the wake of my miraculous deliverance. He began attending our church services regularly, despite the obvious danger this posed to him from his former associates. His testimony about what he had witnessed during my attempted execution carried tremendous weight, particularly among Muslims who had known him before his conversion. Within a month of my return, our church attendance had tripled. People came from across the city to hear about the miracle and to meet the man who had been saved from execution by divine intervention. Many were seeking souls who had been searching for evidence that God still performed miracles in the modern world. Others were existing believers whose faith had been strengthened by hearing about God's supernatural protection of his servants. The story began attracting attention from international media outlets as well. A reporter from Reuters interviewed me extensively and published an article that was picked up by news organizations around the world. Christian television networks sent crews to film documentaries about the incident. I found myself suddenly thrust into a public role that I had never sought or expected. Syrian government officials took notice of the story as well, though their response was more cautious. A representative from the Ministry of Religious Affairs requested a private meeting with me to discuss the incident and its potential impact on religious tensions in the country. While they did not officially acknowledge the supernatural elements of my account, they seemed relieved that the story was generating positive international attention for Syria's Christian minority. The most significant long-term impact was the transformation that occurred within our local community. Muslims began visiting our church services out of curiosity, and several families converted to Christianity after hearing Ahmad's testimony about what he had witnessed. Other pastors reported increased boldness in their preaching, knowing that God had demonstrated his willingness to protect his servants in supernatural ways. Ahmad became my closest partner in ministry, serving as both my bodyguard and my most effective evangelist to the Muslim community. His intimate knowledge of Islamic theology, combined with his dramatic conversion experience, made him uniquely qualified to engage in religious dialogue with seekers from his former faith. Together, we saw more conversions in the 6 months following my deliverance than our church had experienced in the previous 3 years combined. Even those in power recognized that something beyond human understanding had occurred in that concrete courtyard, and the ripple effects of God's intervention continued to spread throughout our nation like waves expanding from a stone dropped into still water. The transformation in my preaching style became immediately apparent to everyone who had known me before my captivity. Where I had once delivered carefully crafted theological sermons filled with scholarly references and measured conclusions, I now spoke with an authority that came from having witnessed God's supernatural power firsthand. Every message carried the weight of someone who had looked death in the face and seen Jesus intervene at the crucial moment. My first sermon after returning was titled "When Heaven Touches Earth," and I preached it to a standing room only crowd that included many people I had never seen in our church before. As I described the blinding light that filled the courtyard and the overwhelming presence of God that caused armed militants to fall prostrate, I could see the impact on every face in the sanctuary. Some people wept openly, others raised their hands in worship, and a few seemed to be experiencing their own encounters with the divine. The invitations to speak at other churches began arriving within weeks of my return. Pastors from Damascus, Homs, and Latakia requested that I visit their congregations to share my testimony. Each speaking engagement brought new opportunities to witness God's continuing work in the hearts of those who heard the account of my miraculous deliverance. I began to understand that my experience in that courtyard was not meant only for my personal benefit, but was intended to strengthen the faith of Christians throughout Syria and beyond. Within 6 months, I received my first invitation to speak at an international Christian conference in Lebanon. Standing before an audience of 1,500 believers from across the Middle East, I shared my testimony with an interpreter translating into Arabic, French, and English simultaneously. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of people coming forward during the altar call to recommit their lives to Christ or to accept Him as their Savior for the first time. That conference led to additional international speaking opportunities in Jordan, Egypt, and eventually in Europe and North America. Each venue brought unique challenges and blessings. European audiences were often skeptical of supernatural claims and required detailed explanations of the cultural and political context of my experience. American congregations, by contrast, seemed hungry for evidence that God still performed miracles in the contemporary world. Ahmad accompanied me on many of these speaking tours, and his testimony as the would-be executioner who encountered Christ proved even more powerful than my own account in many settings. Hearing a former Islamic militant describe his supernatural encounter with Jesus Christ and his subsequent conversion had a profound impact on audiences who might otherwise have dismissed the story as Christian propaganda or wishful thinking. Our church in Aleppo continued to grow at an unprecedented rate throughout this period. By the first anniversary of my deliverance, we had expanded from our original 50 members to more than 300 regular attendees. The growth created practical challenges as our small building could no longer accommodate the crowds that gathered for Sunday services. We began holding multiple services each weekend and eventually secured a larger facility that could seat 400 people. The expansion of our ministry required the training of additional pastoral staff and lay leaders. Ahmad proved exceptionally gifted at evangelism and discipleship, particularly with new converts from Muslim backgrounds who faced unique challenges in their faith journey. Together, we developed a comprehensive program for training church planters who could establish new congregations in areas where Christian presence had been minimal. The security situation in Syria remained dangerous throughout this period, but I found that my fear of persecution had been completely eliminated by my encounter with God's supernatural protection. Where I had once carefully planned my movements to avoid drawing attention from hostile forces, I now traveled openly and spoke boldly about my faith regardless of the potential consequences. This newfound courage was not recklessness, but rather a deep confidence that my life remained in God's hands. Sarah's role in our ministry also expanded dramatically during this time. She began leading women's conferences throughout Syria and neighboring countries, sharing her own testimony about maintaining faith during her husband's captivity and disappearance. Her message of trusting God during seasons of uncertainty resonated powerfully with women who were facing their own challenges related to war, persecution, and family separation. Our children, who had been quite young at the time of my captivity, grew up hearing the story of their father's miraculous deliverance as a normal part of their family history. Rather than being traumatized by the knowledge of what had almost happened, they developed an unshakable confidence in God's protection and power. Both of them began showing signs of their own calling to ministry, with our son expressing interest in pastoral work, and our daughter demonstrating exceptional gifts for teaching and evangelism. The international attention surrounding my testimony opened doors for humanitarian work that extended far beyond our local congregation. Christian organizations in Europe and North America began partnering with us to provide aid to displaced Syrian families, medical care for war victims, and educational opportunities for children whose schooling had been interrupted by the conflict. Our church became a distribution center for international relief efforts throughout our region. One of the most significant long-term impacts of my experience was the establishment of a network of underground churches throughout areas of Syria controlled by extremist groups. Pastors who had heard my testimony gained courage to continue their ministries despite intense persecution, knowing that God could protect his servants in supernatural ways when it served his purposes. Several of these pastors later shared their own accounts of miraculous deliverances that occurred after they committed themselves fully to God's protection. The theological implications of my experience became a subject of discussion in seminaries and Christian universities around the world. Some scholars questioned whether such dramatic supernatural interventions were still occurring in the modern era, while others pointed to my account as evidence that the age of miracles had not ended. I found myself participating in academic conferences and theological symposiums, sharing my perspective as someone who had experienced God's power firsthand rather than simply studying it in theory. So I'm asking you, just as a pastor would, what would you do if God gave you a second chance at life and a platform to share his goodness with the world? Would you use that opportunity to retreat to safety and comfort? Or would you embrace the responsibility that comes with being a witness to his supernatural power? My answer to that question shaped every decision I made in the years following my deliverance. Instead of seeking security in exile or comfortable obscurity, I chose to maximize the impact of the testimony God had given me. Every speaking engagement, every interview, every conversation became an opportunity to proclaim that the God of the Bible still intervenes in human affairs when it serves his purposes. The ripple effects of that March morning in 2014 continue to this day. Churches throughout the Middle East report increased boldness in evangelism and discipleship. Former Muslims who converted to Christianity after hearing my testimony have themselves become pastors and church planters. International Christian organizations have redirected resources toward supporting persecuted churches in regions they had previously considered too dangerous for ministry. Perhaps most importantly, the story has provided hope and encouragement to Christians facing persecution around the world. Believers in North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, and other hostile environments have drawn strength from knowing that God protected one of his servants in supernatural ways when human protection was impossible. The testimony serves as a reminder that we serve a God who is not limited by political boundaries, military weapons, or human hatred. Every day since March 8th, 2014 has been a gift from heaven, and I have tried to steward that gift with the gravity and gratitude it deserves. They thought they were ending my story when they placed me on my knees in that courtyard, but Jesus was actually writing a new chapter for his kingdom that continues to unfold with each person who hears this testimony and chooses to trust him more completely. The miraculous deliverance was not the end of my story, but rather the beginning of a ministry that has touched thousands of lives across multiple continents. If God can save me from a beheading in Syria, he can handle whatever challenges you are facing in your own life, and he can use your testimony to encourage others who desperately need to hear about his faithfulness and power.